Hey, everybody. Dan McClellan here, scholar of the Bible and religion. I've got a little time this morning. I guess it's still morning. So I thought I would come on and see how everybody's doing. Just sharing this link in a few places. So just give me a minute or two and I will be back. Hey. All right, there we go. All right. Simpsons technical difficulties card. Is everybody able to see me okay and hear me okay? Hey, everybody. Am I fluent in German? No, I took German all through high school, and I am pretty rusty at it, but I can read German fairly well, which is what I need to do for some scholarship. It's still, I'm not as good at it as I would like. My wife speaks German a lot better than I do. All right, cool. Normally I have this mic right here in front of me, but for whatever reason on StreamYard now, I can't get it to change the setting to that mic. So actually I'm going to unplug all that. Mick Jacobs has a big question. What's your big question? Das ist nicht ein pair of pants? Stimmt. Audio sounds pretty good. It's going through my phone right now, and I guess that's good enough. I've been struggling with lav mics lately. I got the new iPhone, which switched to the USB-C port, and so I had to get new lav mics, and none of them work well enough. Are there any good books you'd suggest regarding how the various translations of the Bible came about? It depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about ancient translations like the Septuagint and the Vulgate and things like that, there are some monographs, some academic books that are going to talk about that in a lot more detail. Timothy Michael Law's book, When God Spoke Greek, is a good discussion of the little bit about the background of the Septuagint, talks about the use of the Septuagint within early Christianity. There are some books that focus on Bible translation, but frequently in the modern world. So not necessarily like Greek, Latin, Gothic languages, but more like German, English, that kind of stuff. Let's see if I can remember some of the better ones. There's a good one. I don't have it here. But John Barton published a great book on Bible translation called The Word. Hang on just a second. So John Barton published So he wrote this book, A History of the Bible, the book and its faiths, which I always recommend to folks who want an intro to a broad introduction to biblical scholarship. And then he recently came out with The Word, How We Translate the Bible and Why It Matters, which is a wonderful discussion about Bible translation. But again, this is going to be mainly modern stuff. Although there is a little bit that discusses things like the Septuagint. Can you talk about Christmas and give us an idea when actually the Nativity happened? We're just guessing when it comes to when Jesus was born. And the accounts in Matthew and in Luke contradict each other so thoroughly that we don't know if either has any relationship to when Jesus was actually born. So I don't think we can know for sure. And harmonizing Matthew and Luke is also problematic. Hey, are the angels mentioned in Revelation, death, plague, pestilence, war, the same as Resheph, Dever, and Ketev? I think there are folks who have argued that. I don't know that I think the author was trying to do that, but it's certainly possible. Somebody says audio is a bit tinny. Yeah, it's just coming through my phone. Let me try this one more time. Got my interface turned on, got everything plugged in. Is it? Yeah, that's all plugged in. Cloud lifter's good. Let me try this one more time, see if I can change the audio. Nope. Yeah. So for now, it's just going to go through my phone. Hi, Dan. What is the academic consensus on the topic of speaking in tongues and the interpretation of tongues mentioned in the epistles? Well, there are a couple of different things that are going on in the idea of speaking in tongues. There's glossolalia, and the main idea seems to just be this notion that people are supernaturally endowed with this ability to communicate in either otherworldly languages or in languages they don't already know, and then other people have the ability to interpret. This is just something that was probably part of the I don't know if they're part of the mystery cults, but this was just something that was kind of in the air in first century CE Greco-Roman religious practice. I don't know that any scholars think that there's anything actually supernatural going on, or that anyone was actually speaking in these unknown languages. I've seen glossolalia. I've seen people talking in tongues, and it's always very repetitive. There are never enough syllables to actually be a useful, meaningful language. So I think it's just people repeating sounds and coming up with new and different sounds to make it sound like it's a real language. Hey, Dan, what are some good books you recommend for after we die? Not a whole lot of reading going on after you die, but if you are talking about books that cover the topic of that, from a biblical perspective, Finney has a wonderful book. I think it's Mark Finney. Maybe Mark is not right. No, it's Mark. Okay, let me just share this real quick. In terms of ideas about the afterlife in the Bible, I think this is one of the better ones that I have seen. Mark Finney's book, Resurrection, Hell, and the Afterlife, Body and Soul in Antiquity, Judaism, and Early Christianity. There are also, excuse me, if you want to talk about the Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel, a couple of good books are back here. A second. Somewhere back here. Dang it. Well, I don't know where they went, but Chris Hayes wrote a wonderful book on a covenant with death, which is all about how death is represented in First Isaiah, and then also is talking about how the afterlife is kind of constructed within ancient West Asia. So there's Egyptian, there's Mesopotamian, there's Israelite, there's Ugaritic ways that they handle death and things like that. Hang on just a second. Why no Christian Bible match the earliest original Koine Greek New Testament or Hebrew scripture sources? There are a few different things that could be going on there. There are, actually, I can show you. So we're constantly trying to refine our reconstruction of the earliest texts of the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. So this is the most up-to-date critical edition of the Greek New Testament that's available. It's called NA 28, Nestle Aland 28. And this contains the text of the New Testament. And this is what's called an eclectic manuscript, which means that it is not representative of a single ancient manuscript. Rather, this is the result of cobbling together readings from all known manuscripts, from the thousands of different New Testament manuscripts that we have, to try to arrive at what we believe to be the closest reconstructible version of, or the earliest reconstructible version of the New Testament. And then it also has cross references along the side, and then the critical apparatus contains references to variant readings that we find in different manuscripts. So if there's a variant reading, it will tell you what manuscripts have the reading that is included in the text, and then it will tell you what manuscripts have other readings. So for the New Testament, that's what we have available. The standard critical edition of the Hebrew Bible is called the BHS, Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia, and this is arranged very similarly, although this is what's known as a diplomatic edition, not an eclectic edition. So whereas for the New Testament, we are cobbling together an edition from all the available manuscripts, a diplomatic edition exactly reproduces the text of a single manuscript, and specifically the Leningrad Codex. And so it also reproduces the notes that are in the manuscript, the Masora Parva and the Masora Magna, or the large and small Masora that the Masoretes put together. And it also has a critical apparatus at the bottom. So this is what is generally used for the Hebrew Bible. But it has its limits as well. Among other things, the critical apparatus is not easy to use, has a lot of Latin abbreviations. It also does not fully incorporate the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so now we are putting together what's called the Biblia Hebraica Quinta, or the 5th edition of the Biblia Hebraica, and it's coming together fascically, meaning each book is being published as its own fascicle. And then once it's all done, it will all come out as a single volume. And so this is the newest version. This is the newest fascicle that's been published. It was just published, I think, just a couple months ago, actually. But this is Job. And this also has the text with the Masora Magna, the Masora Parva, and then the critical apparatus, where instead of Latin abbreviations, it's English abbreviations. And it fully incorporates all the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then in these fascicles, half of the book is also discussions about some of the more interesting text critical issues that the editors have run across. So that's what we're doing to try to reconstruct the earliest text. And then it's up to translators to try to translate it as faithfully as they can. And I'm thinking, I just picked these up at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, and I'm thinking about giving them away. Because I have digital, I might like scan this for myself and then give it away. We'll see. But that was probably a longer-winded question than what you intended. Hang on just a second. Shamgar Zoxcode asks, hey, Dan, hope you're having a good day. Having a wonderful day. Thank you. Speaking of languages, are there any fake languages, conlangs, I think the cool kids call them, that you enjoy? I mean, besides like Elvish and Klingon, I think Esperanto is probably the most concerted effort at actually producing a usable fake language that was intended to become a real language. But I think it's obviously didn't really take off very well. But yeah, I think I like the sound of of Elvish. That and Klingon. Oh, there are a couple others that I've run into in the past, but none of them ever really caught my eye. Hey, Dan, what's the history of the wedding ring? I do not know. That is an interesting question. I'll have to look into that. What about holy water? Were there earlier practices that its use was based on? Any good places to look for how this came about? That's an interesting question too that I have not thought about before, but I will. In fact, let me just make a note. All right, I'm going to look into that. I'm just seeing if there are any resources that pop up right off the bat. There's a paper called Holy Water, the Works of Water in Defining and Understanding Holiness from about 7 years ago, which is analyzing holy water in 3 different religious traditions: Christianity in Northern Europe, Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity, and Hinduism. It talks about how the holy water is believed to have a divine agency, which is something I'm always interested in hearing more about. So I'll have to look into that more. I've not looked into that before, but thank you for a great question. Alpha Centurion, thank you so much for the question. What do you think of the One Gospel JBP DW are using for their series? I don't know what translation they're using. Excuse me. The One Gospel. I'm gonna have to look into that. I've heard about this. I've thought about getting his book just to just to dismantle it, but I have not looked into this One Gospel. I assume this is a translation that they're using, but let me just make another note. Or maybe this is a piece of secondary literature. I'll have to look into that. But thank you for the question. That's it wasn't something I was aware of. Oscar, thank you so much for the question. Has AI made to Bible scholarship the good kind? I think there are definitely ways that AI is going to influence Bible scholarship. There are definitely going to be good ways. People have been using computer programming and things like that for a long time to help with interpreting and analyzing the Bible. And I think AI is going to make that a lot easier, but it's going to take a lot of discipline to do it well and the right way. Otherwise, it's just going to garbage in, garbage out. That's what the majority of AI that I see on the internet is right now. And I think that's going to be an awful lot of what Bible scholarship tries to do with it. I've seen folks trying to use like Bible AI bots to answer questions, and they're just awful. So, but yeah, absolutely. When it comes to Bible translation, when it comes to Bible scholarship, there are folks dealing with it. In fact, I gave a presentation at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature on cognitive science and how cognitive science has influenced my scholarship. And one of the questions was about AI, and particularly related to cognitive linguistics. But I think it's going to have a broader impact than that. But I think we have to wait and see what exactly happens. JC Tyrone, thank you so much for the question. What resource would you suggest for an understanding of the debates about the Trinity in early Christianity? Let me pull up some discussions. Some of them, most of them are actually going to be pretty conservative. So not things that I would wholeheartedly endorse. But there's also going to be an awful lot of data that can be mined from these sources as well. So I'm just pulling up some books. And that one. Okay. So again, these are not of equal quality and value, but here are some of the things that I usually go to first. Matthew Bates, The Birth of the Trinity, Jesus, God, and Spirit in New Testament and Early Christian Interpretations of the Old Testament. This is from 2015. That's an Oxford University Press book. Here we got the table of contents. That's going to be pretty helpful for a critical review of the doctrine of the Trinity. Anthony Buzzard and Charles Hunting's book, the subtitle is Christianity's Self-Inflicted Wound. If you want something that's going to be critical, that's probably going to be among the better things available. A Brief History of the Doctrine of the Trinity in the Early Church. This is a T&T Clark book. This is going to be a little bit more conservative, but is still going to have a lot of good data. So I would recommend this one as well. Marian Hiller, this is a Cambridge University Press book, From Logos to Trinity, The Evolution of Religious Beliefs from Pythagoras to Tertullian. This is also going to have a lot of good information. This is from 2012. You can see the table of contents there. Cambridge Companion to the Trinity by this is edited by Peter Fawn. This is going to be a large edited volume, so lots of different chapters from lots of different authors. That is also going to include more contemporary stuff. So if you want a broader, sweeping discussion, that's going to be helpful. There's also the Oxford Handbook of the Trinity, edited by Emery and Levering. This is from when is this from? 2011. Same deal. It's going to be a pretty broad, sweeping discussion. This one's going to be a little longer than the Cambridge Companion, but it's going to cover ancient to modern stuff. And then this one, I believe, is more Catholic in orientation, The Trinity on the Nature and Mystery of the One God. And then we have The Trinity, the Central Mystery of Christianity by Hans Schwartz. And I think this is Fortress Press, so this is also going to be a little more conservative as well. So that's where I would recommend you start. And there's going to be plenty of stuff in there, different directions if you're interested in deeper dives. Leslie King, thank you so much. Is the Ananias story and Achan story ripoff? Certainly influenced by it. Certainly there's an element of it, but not just a ripoff, no. That doesn't necessarily mean it actually happened, but they weren't just like, let's just take that story and retell it. I think that was, but it definitely influenced the way it was formulated. Jennifer Lee, thank you so much for a very generous super chat question. How much were Judaism and Christianity influenced by Zoroastrianism? Any books on this? Yeah, we've got a couple books. One that I think, let's see. Mary Boyce is going to be your best resource for primary stuff related to Zoroastrianism, but there's also some other, I'll recommend one other text. So here we've got textual sources for the study of Zoroastrianism, edited and translated by Mary Boyce. So this is going to be a bunch of different texts, prayers, ritual things, that kind of stuff, if you want to read the primary text related to Zoroastrianism. And then Mary Boyce also published, why is this not? Okay, there we go. In 96, A History of Zoroastrianism, Volume 1, the early period. And then there's a Wiley Blackwell companion to Zoroastrianism, edited by Strasberg and Vevina, that is going to have a bunch of papers by a bunch of different authors. Some of it talking about intersections, for instance, chapter 26 on Judaism, from Mithra to Roman Mithras, Richard Gordon, a well-respected expert on Mithraism, Christianity. So that's going to be probably the most insightful for a broad range of questions about Zoroastrianism. But thank you for a great question. Eddie Romanoff, thank you so much for the sticker. TMJ Health, thank you so much. Greetings, Dan. Greetings, TMJ Health. Thank you for your work. I appreciate the very kind words. for your work. Does Romans 13:1-7 apply to President-elect Trump? No, it only applied to ancient Rome, because Paul thought that the world was coming to an end pretty imminently. And so Romans 13:1 is basically just saying, play nice with the Romans, because God set them up. So nobody can rule without God's say so. It is not any kind of prophecy. It's not any kind of authoritative statement about anything after Paul's day. It was just Paul's practical attempt to try to get followers of Jesus to play nice with the Romans so that they could survive to see Jesus return in power and destroy the Romans and then institute the kingdom of God. So he didn't think there would be any other earthly powers that were relevant. Dancer425, Susan, thank you so much for the question. You've talked about differences in sexual ethics in ancient and modern societies. What are the differences in ancient and modern views of romantic/marital love? Example, Jacob loved Rachel, but not Leah. We don't have a ton of personal insights into individual concepts of romantic love. Certainly it was an element of it, but how socially salient it was, I don't know that we have a ton of information on that. It was absolutely there. I don't think much of it has bubbled to the surface of biblical scholarship. An awful lot of it has to do with sexual politics more than with romanticism. I think the best glimpse that we have into it is what we see in the Song of Songs, which is erotic poetry. And there are other texts from Egypt and Mesopotamia and elsewhere that use erotic poetry as well. There's a wonderful book by Jennifer Knust called, let me see if I have a PDF of it. I should. Yeah, it doesn't, you don't get to see the cover, but one of the best named books in a while, Unprotected Texts, the Bible's Surprising Contradictions About Sex and Desire. This is a wonderful book that discusses a bunch of different stuff going on in the Bible related to sex and desire. Let's see, the Bible and the joy of sex, desire in and out of control. We've got biblical marriage. I think that's the chapter that talks about the Song of Songs. But yeah, I think that's going to be a better discussion than I'll be able to briefly give you about romantic love in the Bible. Hang on just a minute. Yeah, most of the resources I think I have are going to have more to do with sexual politics and gender and things like that than with romantic or marital love. But let me just see. Oh, here's an interesting. This looks like it's a paper. So from a Hebrew Studies article published a few years ago by Hikaru Kumon, it's called "Did Ancient Israelites Fall in Love? A Cross-Linguistic Semantic Approach to Ahav." I first explained the shortcomings of approaches that take for granted that English emotion concepts are universal. Then I argue that it is possible to reconstruct the definition of Ahav if we make a deliberate attempt to avoid being drawn into our English conceptual world. Instead, we must emulate the structure of thought evident in the Hebrew text. Finally, after producing a definition for the fall in love sense of Ahav, I show how the Ahav stories in the Hebrew Bible correspond with my definition. So that would that would get a little closer to answering your question. But thank you so much for the question, Susan. Baxter, thank you so much. Hang on just a second. I've got to make sure I haven't gotten too far away from my Discord. And for those of you who don't know, when I do live streams, I can be absent-minded about it, but one of the incentives to join my Patreon is you get priority in all my live streams through the Discord. So I have a live stream channel on my Discord where people are posting questions, and as long as I remember, sometimes when I pull other windows up, then the Discord window goes away and I forget about it. Out of sight, out of mind. Baxter, thank you so much for the question. Ezekiel 16 says the sin of Sodom was lack of hospitality, but does sodomy in the New Testament mean that too? When did sodomy come to mean anal sex? So it has kind of meant a couple of different things, but we don't really have the word. I'm almost positive if I don't think the word sodomy actually occurs anywhere in the New Testament, but let me see if it has been, if there's something that has been translated that way. Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't see any word that could plausibly be translated that way. But let me see where the I'm looking at the etymonline.com to see where sodomy comes from. So circa 1300, unnatural sexual relations such as those customs imputed to the inhabitants of biblical Sodom, especially between men, but also with beasts, from Old French sodomie. Compare late Latin peccatum sodomiticum, anal sex, literally the sin of Sodom, from Latin sodoma. But there have been two main senses. One is probably, I think, the most salient one in earlier periods was the non-consensual kind. And then only later did the use of that word in reference to consensual male same-sex intercourse bubble to the surface. So yeah, I don't know that word was ever used in the New Testament for it, but certainly from early periods, the sin of Sodom was understood by folks who thought that same-sex intercourse was icky, to primarily be about that. And of course, it's not. Genesis 19 is about inhospitality. Ezekiel 6 is a confirmation of that. Jude verse 7 is not talking about male same-sex intercourse when it refers to, they translated a lot of different ways, unnatural lust, unnatural desire, something like that. But the word is sarkosoteros, or the phrase is sarkosoteros, which means other flesh. And this is a reference to angelic and human intercourse, crossing those species boundaries in their intercourse. It has nothing to do with same-sex intercourse. Josephat, thank you so much for the question. Hi, Dan. I just want to say thanks for the last two videos on homosexuality. I appreciate the kind words. Also, any book on the topic you recommend? I just got the one from Thomas Romer and Luis Bonjour Salud desde Mexico. On that particular topic, there are an awful lot of books that give a lot of context. Now, my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, has a chapter. I believe it's chapter 9. Let me remind myself. No, it's not chapter 9. It's chapter 14. So each chapter of my book addresses a different claim about what the Bible says. And so chapter 14 addresses the claim that the Bible says homosexuality is an abomination. So I go into quite a bit of detail there about that. Let me see if I have some good, what references I have in here. Bernadette Bruton, Love Between Women, Early Christian Responses to Female Homoeroticism, is from 96. That's a really good one. William Loader has several good books on ancient Judaism and Christianity and sexuality. So the New Testament on sexuality. He's got another one on like Philo and Josephus on sexuality. He's got one on like the Testaments and apocryphal texts on sexuality. Marilyn B. Skinner has a wonderful book, Sexuality in Greek and Roman Culture. The second edition from 2014 is the one I would recommend. Those are the ones that are springing to mind. So that chapter might be accessible and helpful. And hang on just one second. Brandon Robinson, maybe you know Brandon from social media, also published a book called The Gospel of Inclusion, A Christian Case for LGBT plus Inclusion in the Church, and has a new one coming out. I actually wrote a blurb for it a bit ago. I know that the title has changed since I read it. Give me just one moment. When I read the draft, which was an uncorrected draft, and I understand that the title has changed, but the title at the time was "Devout: Reclaiming the Bible for Queer Christians," also by Brandon Robertson. So those are a couple books that you could check out as well. Hopefully that answers your question. Sebastian Elder, thank you so much for the question. Before all four Gospels have their names around 180 CE, do we have any manuscripts that either should have the traditional author's name that don't, or any that actually do have the author's name? I don't think we have any manuscripts from the 2nd century that have the title. I think, if I recall, and I could very well be wrong, I think the earliest manuscript is right around the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd century CE, but I could be wrong on that. But we don't have any where we have the very beginning of the gospel and there is no title. But it's rare to have the very beginning of the gospel anyway. But what we do have are manuscripts where the title is appearing in different parts of the manuscript, which many critical scholars interpret as an indication that the title is being added by the copyists and that it is not something that came with the source. In other words, if it was something that the copyists had in their original source, they would have reproduced it exactly as they found it. And if it came from the authors or from an Ur manuscript, from an autograph, it should be in one place rather than moving around. So some scholars interpret that as an indication that the attribution of authorship is a secondary addition to the manuscripts. Any books that came out this year relevant to biblical studies that you recommend to add to a Christmas list? The ones that I'm thinking of are far too are far too nerdy. Like when I was at the Society of Biblical Literature, Logan Williams came up to me and asked what book I just bought, and I showed him this book, and he went, "Nerd." So yeah, there are some books that have come out. Let me see. I still need to read this. I have only cracked the book and not gotten deep enough into it. This is a couple years old, but Women and the Religion of Ancient Israel by Susan Ackerman is, I think, going to be a phenomenal book. I am going to be recording a podcast episode with April Ajoy on her new book, Star Spangled Jesus, soon. There is, let's see, just one second. Where did it go? Sorry, I'm trying to find there's a new book on John the Baptist that was recently published by James McGrath, and I don't know where my copy went. So James McGrath has published a couple different biographies, a more popular one for a general audience, and then a longer academic one. There it is. I see it. Both of these came out this year. The more popular, much smaller one, it's called Christ Maker, A Life of John the Baptist. And then his longer academic one is called John of History, Baptist of Faith, The Quest for the Historical Baptizer. Those are some interesting books that I would highly recommend for anyone interested in the background of Christianity. Vishanti asks, how was Disneyland? Busy. I was there over Thanksgiving with my family, my 3 daughters. We had a wonderful time. But yeah, it was busy. Only a few breakdowns, but for the most part, we had a lovely time. And somebody says they just love the framing of this. This was sent to me by someone last year. It's not just an action figure of me with data over dogma on the shirt, but as it does, it speaks. Nah, I'm good.
All right, let's see it. Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion.
So yeah, I had no other place to put it except for right here. So it kind of shows up in videos, but I promise you it wasn't intentional. Simone asks, I'm wondering if you have any opinions on how the Qumran community residents projected to be 20 to 80 people under one model or more than 200 under another acquired as much material wealth as are represented in even some of the caves. That's thousands of hours of labor. No worries if you don't have the expertise, but that's what's on my mind right now. It could be that these are folks who are bringing that that kind of wealth into the community. It's they're living a more communal lifestyle. So kind of in the sense of Acts 4 and 5, they might be bringing whatever wealth they had with them, but that probably wouldn't have been substantive. I think people with substantive wealth probably wouldn't have wanted to give it all up. They could also be doing things for in order to raise money. I don't know if they were kind of like a little kibbutz and are doing services for other people. That seems less likely to me. But yeah, that is something I don't have an awful lot of expertise on the people who occupied Qumran. But yeah, certainly there was, it seems like they were out kicking the coverage a little bit. Thank you so much for the question, JLWII 2000. What are you familiar with the Flavian signature, and what are your thoughts? It states Jesus was invented by the Romans, which is indicative due to parallels in the story of Flavius versus the Gospels. This is a fringe theory that isn't taken seriously. Well, it's taken seriously, but it is not considered a serious theory by the majority of scholars. There are way too many problems that the theory just has to overlook for it to be a plausible theory of the origins of Jesus. And yeah, we would expect to see more in Josephus. If Josephus is a part of the theory, I'm aware that there are theories that don't involve Josephus, but it's not. It's a fringe theory within the scholarship. Man with no name, thank you for the question. Hey, Dan, what do you think of preterism / partial preterism? Are postmillennialism, premillennialism, amillennialism just forms of preterism? Do any of these interpretations work or don't work? They all work to some degree and don't work to other degrees, but they're all also just attempts to harmonize and univocalize everything. And because the different authors of the New Testament were writing with different ideas to different audiences for different reasons, I think it is fallacious to try to harmonize to begin with. But fundamentally, preterism comes down to an attempt to salvage the failed prophecies of the second coming in light of history. So yeah, like they're just as valid as any other approach, and just as invalid as any other approach that tries to find supernatural agency or insight in the texts. But yeah, none of them unilaterally account for all the details because the details fundamentally conflict. Robert Miller, thank you so much for the question. Is there any legitimacy to the claims that Thales attests to the darkness at the time of the crucifixion as recorded in the gospel accounts? Probably not. I think that the account comes from quite a bit later. And if I recall, the account is dismissive of the claim that this is related to the crucifixion, because it's about an eclipse, isn't it? But an eclipse would be physically impossible anywhere near the Passover, because the Passover is spring equinox. The moon is on the other side of the earth from the sun. Yeah, the historian Thallus explained the darkness at the time of Jesus' crucifixion as a solar eclipse, but I don't think Thallus was around for it. Yada, yada, yada. Yeah, so Julius Africanus is the one who reports on Thallus referring to the darkness at the time of crucifixion of Jesus Christ and explained it away as a solar eclipse. Yeah, it could not possibly have been a solar eclipse around the Passover. So yeah, I don't think anybody takes that seriously. Running Road, thank you so much. Could the like in quote, and the second is like it, love your neighbor, be translated as the same? Or what dimensions can we look for in that like? I don't think exactly the same, but related, similar, like. I think there's kind of a range. You can have, in Hebrew, I would say you can get closer to the idea of a predication that it is identical to. But in Greek, I would have to look closer in how the particular word is used. But I think the idea is similar. I don't think the idea is identical, and I don't think it's measuring on a scale of like significance or authority or something like that. I think it's measuring on a different scale altogether. But I'd have to look a little more closely at what the scholarship has said about that. But thanks for your question. Silent Mandible, thank you so much. Hi, Dan. How are the Ten Commandments generally interpreted in comparison to the rest of the Bible? Do scholars believe they supersede other rules? Well, that's a theological question. Biblical scholarship, according to biblical scholarship, they don't have any authority at all. Everything is of more or less equal authority. And so, but you could look at the way other biblical authors treat it. So the authors of Deuteronomy make reference to the 10 commandments, the 10 words, and then repeat what we have in Exodus 20 with slight differences. However, Exodus 20 doesn't describe these as the 10 commandments. Exodus 36 is where we have a reference to the 10 words, the 10 things, the 10 commandments, and that's the ritual Decalogue, which is entirely different set of commandments. So the authors treat it differently. I think that the 10 commandments become a convenient kind of distillation of the commandments in the minds of some authors, but for biblical scholars, they don't supersede in any sense, because biblical scholars shouldn't be talking about the actual contemporary authority of these texts. And our Francis is telling me that the like in Matthew 22:39 is homia, which is, more. And they say, I agree that the same is probably overstating it, but equally or of the same type might be reasonable. Yeah, I would agree with that. And this is interesting. When you go back to Nicaea, they came up with what is it? Homoousios was the same substance, and somebody wanted to add a iota in there to make it homoousios, which would be like substance or similar substance rather than the identical substance. So that would be one illustration of the difference between calling them identical and similar. Black, Conscious, and Rich, thank you so much for the question. I think you accidentally skipped my questions. I have a lot of respect for your academic views. Can you please answer it? I want to remain factual in my writings. I didn't see. Oh, I apologize. Yeah, it looks like I did skip that. So sorry. What did Jesus mean in John when he says to his fellow Jews or Jewish people that his father is different and theirs is the devil? The idea there, John comes the closest to what we would call anti-Semitism today, where the different Jewish groups, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, they're all just lumped together as the Jews, and pretty widely condemned. And what we've got going on there is this idea that their behavior is indicative of the worldview, the group with which they identify. And so because they're not following Jesus, who represents God the Father, they must be following some other patriarchal influence, some other guide, some other leader. And there's kind of a binary reduction of all of this to you're either following God or you're following the devil. And so since they're not following him, and since he is God's son, they must be following a different father who must be Satan. So it's not saying they literally descend from Satan or anything like that, or that they are knowingly committed to Satan or the devil. It's just saying you're either for us or against us. And if you're not for us, for me, Jesus, then the only other option is that you're of the devil. Similar to how people accuse me of being satanic and influenced by Satan all the time, just because I don't follow their identity politics. But great question, and I apologize for skipping over that. I don't know. I don't know how I skipped over in the process. That was an accident. So my apologies. Burl Bikes, thank you so much for the question. Did you see my question about if Jesus worked at all? Hopefully I didn't miss another one. Let me take a look. I don't think I saw that one. If it's on the main chat, these days I'm rarely able to keep track of what's going on over there. The question was if Jesus worked at all. How did he support himself during his preaching? Would a carpenter make that much money? An itinerant preacher would have lived a pretty ascetic lifestyle, would not have had much, would have relied on the charity and the kindness of others in order to scratch out enough to survive. So we don't really have any information on how Jesus made a living prior to his ministry. Anything that we come up with is going to be pure speculation. The Gospels refer to his father as some kind of, probably not carpenter, but probably something more like mason, somebody who worked in stone or things like that. And Jesus, by the numbers, statistically, probably would have followed in his father's footsteps, but we don't have any information on that. But during his ministry, he would have just been relying on others. While I might have my issues with Logos for being very evangelical, do you have any opinion on Logos versus Accordance as software? Any strengths/weaknesses that weigh into what you use for what? I prefer Accordance over Logos. I think the UI is more intuitive. I think it better facilitates what I'm there to do, which usually has more to do with searching and comparing and analysis than it has to do with just reading. I think Logos is more about just reading stuff, whereas Accordance has a more robust search feature, easier to use, and I think is quicker and better. But Logos was designed on a PC environment. Accordance was designed in a Mac environment. I've always used Mac, so that may be part of why I think that Logos works better for me. Rock and Bones, thank you so much for the question. Dan, is it true that the oldest surviving Hebrew Bible is Codex Sassoon and the oldest NT is even older, Codex Sinaiticus? How do scholars know that the Hebrew text is the more accurate text? It is Codex Sinaiticus is the oldest copy of the whole New Testament. There are manuscripts, partial manuscripts of individual books or in collections of like Pauline epistles and things like that that are earlier, but it's the oldest full one. Codex Sassoon, that's the claim that's been made is that it is the oldest. I have no reason to doubt it, but it's not something that I have seen other scholars acknowledge. I think that claim was made because the text was at auction, And so, you're going to make a sexy claim like that if you've got a text that even has a chance of being the oldest. So I don't know about Codex Sassoon. The Aleppo Codex has always been the oldest, mostly complete manuscript. There are quite a few pages missing from it. Leningrad is the otherwise oldest full manuscript of the Hebrew Bible. But I don't know whether Sassoon is older than Aleppo. Sank, thank you so much for the question. What are your thoughts on Michael Heiser's scholarly work and him as a person? When Googling competently on Psalm 82, I saw that you and he went at it on each other's websites 10 plus years ago. Yeah, I would say that I would call Mike a friend of mine. We disagreed on a lot of things, and even more so politically, but I appreciated what he did for evangelicals in trying to make it less painful to acknowledge that other gods are represented as existing throughout the Hebrew Bible. I think his doctoral dissertation at Madison was a really important piece of scholarship. I wish it had been published as a book. He also wrote some wonderful papers, one of which I cited a few times in a recent essay on monotheism that's going to be published in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Religion. But yeah, we disagreed. We went at it at conferences and on our blogs and things like that, primarily related to whether or not the conceptualization of Adonai and of deity changed, or if it was always the same way. He obviously thought it was always the same way. I obviously thought that it changed, and that was something that, unfortunately, because of his tragic passing, were never able to resolve. But yeah, and as a person, Mike was always nothing but kind to me. But I know we differed on a lot of ideas socially and politically. So, man with no name, thank you so much for the question. What do you think of Nero and his supposed connection with 666, 616? Is there an academic consensus on this? Thoughts on Nero Redivivus? I think the data show that Nero Redivivus was alive, and well, the tradition, the fear, was in circulation for a handful of centuries. I think it's most likely that there was a single emperor that was intended with the 666. I think Nero is the best candidate. There has been a book that was recently published that argues against that reading. It is called, let me show you. The Nero Antichrist, Founding and Fashioning a Paradigm by Shushma Malik, that argues that the Nero Redivivus does not pop up. It did not develop until after the Book of Revelation was composed. It remains to be seen. This was published, I think, this year, 2024. Oh, no, 2020. Why do I... Okay, it was published in 2020. But it remains to be seen if that's going to convince the majority of scholars. But if there was one emperor in mind, I think Nero is the best candidate. Shamgar's Oxgoad asks, when it comes to prophecy and the stories of the prophets like Elijah and Elisha, were these likely people who existed, but stories were written about them after the fact to make them seem prophetic? Were they often spouting prophecy and only the hits were recorded? And do we have record of contemporary or earlier prophecy from other civilizations that today could be argued to have come true? I think they probably were historical figures to one degree or another, and that legends accreted around them. And an example of another character from the book of Numbers who seems to have been an actual historical figure would be Balaam. We have something known as the Balaam inscription that found at Deir Allah, which is an Aramaic-like inscription that refers to a prophet for hire named Balaam. But it dates to around 800 BCE. So that's probably when the book of Numbers decided they were going to incorporate this character into this story. So yeah, there were itinerant prophets. There were prophets for hire. There were court prophets all around this time period. It wouldn't surprise me in the least if Elijah and Elisha were historical figures who had a lot of these legends accreting around them. Contemporary or earlier prophecy from other civilizations that could be argued to have come true. I mean, you have you have claims that so and so prophesied or predicted something in other cultures. I think prophecy as a literary genre is primarily a biblical innovation. There is a different kind of prophecy in other civilizations. So we don't have a lot of prophetic texts, but we do have like instruction manuals, we have training, and we have historical discussions that talk about prophecy, but that's something a little different. Jonka, are you into any manga / anime, or do you mostly prefer Western cartoons? I grew up on Western cartoons. I was too old once Pokemon rolled around, so I didn't get that gateway drug into that kind of animation. My daughter likes quite a bit of that, and she goes to an anime / manga con here in Salt Lake County called Toshokan every year. The only one that I can recall that because she had the T-shirt on just the other day was I'm gonna get it wrong. I think it's Demon Slayer. I don't know if that counts, but she would know far better than I would. But yeah, mostly I enjoy the cartoons that are nostalgic for me from my childhood. Chief Dixon, thank you so much for the question. Dan, Mark 1:1-2, attribute the messenger to John the Baptist. NET notes relate those verses to Exodus 23:20 and Malachi 3:1, but on my reading, I interpret these as three separate individuals. Most scholars would say that Mark 1 is it's conflating Exodus 23 with Malachi 3 in reference to the forerunner, who would be John the Baptist. But yeah, I think Malachi 3 is referring to someone different from Exodus 23, and both are referring to someone different from John the Baptist. So in that sense, yeah, they're definitely three separate individuals. But the way Mark is employing them, Mark is pointing both of them in the direction of John the Baptist. But as I've said in other videos, there's also a sense in which the reference to Exodus 23 is evoking this notion of an angel who can also identify as God, as a way to hint at Jesus's super secret identity. Happy Sky, thank you so much for the question. Did Jesus rise from dead 3 days after crucifixion? There are no data that support that, but that is certainly the claim made in the Gospels, and that is certainly what an awful lot of people believe. But despite the best efforts of scholars to try to substantiate that claim, as of yet, there's nothing to support that other than a desire to believe it. Shamgar's Oxcode says, speaking of the story of Balaam, what was his mistake that caused God to get angry with him, when in the story it seems he's been straight arrow the whole time? Was it to display the unpredictability of deities, or is the story concerning Balaam a strange Frankenstein's monster, or different stories? I think it's the latter. Scholars have noted he's doing what God told him to do, and suddenly God's angry with him. This is nonsensical as the story exists now. So I think it's probably stitching together different things. And the story needs Balaam to be to have God, wagging the finger at him for some reason, and I guess they just weren't concerned with how they got from A to B. So, yeah, I think it's definitely a Frankenstein's monster. Devin Boland, thank you so much for the question. Hi, hello. What do you make of Beverly Child's canonical criticism as an alternative to the historical critical method? Do you think it has merit? It absolutely has merit for people who are taking the text seriously as an authority, as well as people who are looking at the reception of the text. Once the text becomes a text, then it's functioning in a canonical context for everyone receiving it afterwards. So historical critical, what I do on my channel is a conscious effort to say, I'm going to focus on trying to reconstruct what was intended and understood by the authors, the editors, and the earliest audiences, not because that's the only legitimate or the most legitimate way to look at it, but because that's usually the best way to address a lot of the claims that are made, because claims that are made about what the text means so frequently need to retreat to original intent. And so I am intentionally saying I'm focusing on that domain. So canonical criticism has to do with how the text is functioning once it becomes, or once it is a part of that canonical context. And that's absolutely legitimate and probably the best way to look at the reception of the text. So once we get to New Testament authors who are looking at the Jewish scriptures, they're looking at it through a quasi-canonical lens. And so we have to consider that in understanding how they're interpreting it. So, when I talk about Psalm 82, I'm looking at what the authors and the earliest audiences of Psalm 82 were understanding. But when we look at John and Jesus's appeal to Psalm 82 in John 10:34 through 36, we cannot consider what the authors and earliest audiences were thinking. We have to consider how a first century CE Jewish person is reading Psalm 82 in the broader canonical context. There was no canon at the time, but they did have a concept of scripture. So there was kind of a fuzzier pool of scripture that they were looking at. And so that has to be taken into account. So I think we're doing different things, but as long as things are compartmentalized and we're looking at them and evaluating them based on what they're trying to do, yeah, absolutely canonical criticism is valid. Now, once they say the canonical context has authority over all previous contexts, or since the canonical context is how the text is received, we are not allowed to go back into earlier reconstructed versions of the text. I think that's where things get problematic. I skipped somebody's question. I'm sorry. I just been watching The Handmaid's Tale, and they use Genesis 30 verses 1 through 3. Then she said, "Here is my servant Bilhah. Go into her that she may bear upon my knees, and that I too may have children through her." What's the etymology of it looks like birkai. I don't know. I'll have to look at that. Let me pull that up. It looks like just from Barak, but let me take a look. Or yeah, that's just my knees, isn't it? Berach. In the dual, Berachim. Yeah, it looks like it just refers to knees pretty generically, but it's used in a lot of different euphemisms and figurative language. Halot says of this verse, the mistress does the same to the newborn baby of the maidservant. Oh, here we go. The husband takes the newborn baby al birkav in order to own him, so take possession of him. The mistress does the same to the newborn baby of the maidservant. Genesis 30 verse 3. So upon my knees just means that it was the maidservant delivering the baby, but once the baby is delivered, now I'm taking possession of the baby because the mistress was just a surrogate. Hopefully that makes sense. And it is hard to read the Hebrew on the on the Discord thing. All right, now I've got to catch up. Just a moment. Aldo Zamudio, thank you so much for the, I believe that's what's called a sticker. Arik Hendricks, thank you so much for the question. What fiction do you read besides comics, if any? Any exposure to B. Sanderson? If you do read fiction, do you find that your background in cognitive linguistics helps / hurts your enjoyment of fiction? I have not read fiction for a long time, which is unfortunate because I would like to have the time to be able to do some recreational reading. I used to read, my mom, when I was in high school, gave me a list of the 100 best English language books of all time. And I spent years whittling away at that list. but it's been over a decade since I've been able to look at any of that. I used to enjoy Stephen King and John Grisham and things like that, but yeah, it's been a long time since I've done any reading of fiction. I think the last fiction book I wrote read was probably historical fiction from my grad school days. I read As a Driven Leaf, which is about Rabbi Akiva, historical fiction about Rabbi Akiva. But yeah, but usually when I'm engaging something for recreation, I turn most of the other stuff off in terms of my analytical lenses, so that I can just enjoy it for what it is. Daniel Reagan, thank you so much for the question. Hi, Dan. Currently making my way through the Jubilees. Is there any reason why they killed Esau the way they did in this particular narrative? I can't think of any specific reason. I'm sure there are scholars who have discussed that, but I don't remember off the top of my head what any such reasoning might be. Give me just 1 second. And I will see if there's the Hermenea commentary on Jubilees by James Vander Kam is second to none. Let me just see if he says anything specific about what's going on there. War, forces, war. Seems more likely than the next passage. So here he says, Genesis 36 does not speak about Esau's death, and goes on to explain in the next verse that the extent of the brothers' possessions prevented them from living closer together. It seems more likely that the next passage of the Midrash quotes, part of Amos 1:11, prove more important in giving rise to a story about a war between the brothers. There the Lord says through the prophet regarding Edom, because he pursued his brother with the sword and cast off all pity. Then come the lines quoted in the Midrash, he maintained his anger perpetually and kept his wrath forever. These sorts of considerations were surely more important in the creation of a story about a war between Jacob and Esau than a desire to rewrite events of the 2nd century BCE. Whoever fashioned the story first, each writer used it shaped it to meet the needs of his composition. In Jubilees, the story demonstrates why there was such animosity between the sons of Jacob and the sons of Esau, and why the latter should be subject to the former. The author could be inviting the reader to connect the story to circumstances in his time, perhaps the ongoing spread of Idumeans into formerly Judean territory, by using the expression until today, though in the narrative world of Jubilees, today is the time when the angel is speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai. The story also adds to Jacob's stature. He wants to live in harmony with his brother. He did not start the conflict, but took up arms out of necessity, and he still had the decency to bury his brother and spare his incorrigible sons. That's a much better answer than I would be able to give off the top of my head, but I would recommend checking out Vander Kam's Hermenea commentary on Jubilees for more detail. Trevor, thank you so much for the question. What do you know about the differences in temple theology / ritual between First and Second Temple Judaism? There were probably enormous differences. I think Josiah's reforms are probably the main ones, and then whatever we get from the exile and the post-exilic literature from the priestly class regarding temple sacrifices, I think they were phenomenally different. I think that prior to Josiah, there were temples all over ancient Israel and Judah, and there was probably worship of other deities going on in those temples as well, probably including Asherah. That was probably one of the things that fell in the crosshairs of Josiah's reforms, or at least rhetorical reforms. And by the time of the Second Temple, it was a lot more oriented toward the Deuteronomistic outlook than it was toward First Temple stuff. So, yeah, I think couldn't catalog all the differences. But basically, I think everything changed after Josiah. Happy Sky, thank you for the question. Is Jesus the Son of God who rose from the dead? That is the claim of most of the New Testament authors, and that's certainly how a lot of people interpret the text. But again, there are no data that support the reality of that outside of those texts. Burrell Bikes, thank you for another question. Who is the earliest deity we can identify in human history? Ooh, that's a tough one, because we have a lot of indications of worship of specific deities that go back before written language. But there are going to be deities identified in Sumerian and Egyptian texts by name that are going to be the earliest that we could identify by name, precisely because they were the first to develop written language. But I don't recall off the top of my head which deities those would be. But if you want to some good resources, I still have to take this out of the shrink wrap and sign it and then send it on to the person who won the giveaway. But the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible talks about an awful lot of that. And there's also an encyclopedia. Hang on just a second. There are a couple of other things you could look at. One is the encyclopedia or dictionary, Dictionary of Gods and Goddesses by Michael Jordan. This is the second edition, and I think that's going to, yeah, it's just a dictionary, so very similar to the Dictionary of Deities and Demons in the Bible. There's another one. Give me just a second. A more recent one came out that I've got to find. Where is it? No, that's that one. Sorry for the dead air here. Let me, and that's peculiar. There was just a bit ago, another dictionary / encyclopedia of gods and goddesses or deities or something like that came out. I know I have a PDF of it, but I don't remember exactly what the title was. So I'm having trouble tracking it down. Huh. Yeah, I can't remember. No, that's not it. No. I guess I'm going to have to, yeah, I'm going to have to figure out where that thing went. Yeah, but there are Yeah, I don't know the name of the deity, but certainly we have indications of specific deities being worshipped prior to the existence of written language. Perhaps some ancient carvings made from tusks or stone or things like that represent hybrid creatures, human/walrus creatures or things like that. Maybe those were deities. Maybe those were things that were worshipped. We don't know, though. Our Mark Reasoner Jr., whom I believe I just met at SBL. Thank you so much for the question. Thoughts on Hebrew, kaphar, keeper, and Leviticus? I'm translating Leviticus for a publication, and I think I should avoid the theologically loaded word atonement. Seems we also have a homonym problem. Yeah, that's a tricky one. Atonement is definitely a loaded one. I think we... yeah, that's a tricky one. Because I think it can be used in different ways as well. I don't know if expiation is a well-known enough word, at least in English. I'm just curious what Hallowed has to say about this. To appease, make amends, make atonement, make good, avert. Yeah. Not a ton of helpful stuff there. Appease someone. Because I think the idea is to... fundamentally, it refers to covering. It's used to refer to, unless you think that's the homonym problem, that the idea of covering with pitch is the homophone that means something different. Then the idea could be to cover in the sense of make whole. It could be cover in the sense of Hallowed here says. Kiper panav, personal name, to cover someone's face with a gift, meaning to cause someone to be favorably inclined towards oneself. I might look in the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, unless you already have and don't find that adequate. If that's not adequate, you might need to do your own, come up with your own paper to write about, your own word study, if you think that there's a better way to conceptualize the conceptual imagery that is trying to evoke. But thanks for a great question. I'll have to look into that. Rock and Bones. Dan, if Jesus was put in a tomb, was it to be a permanent tomb or temporary? Would Jewish women prepare the body of male relatives? If it was temporary, then the body was expected to be moved. No, it would have been thought to have been permanent in the sense that their body was not going to be going anywhere else. But the body would be set in one spot in order to decompose. And then, like after a year, the bones would be gathered up and they would be put in an ossuary, which was a smaller bone box. And then that would be put in a little hole that would have been carved into the stone as well. And that way, they had room for the next body that would be put on the larger space that was reserved for bodies. In earlier time periods, when the body was decomposed, they would collect the bones, and there was usually a hole or a pit underneath the bench tomb, and the bones were just tossed in there. And that way, after a while, you had a mountain of bones. And some people think that the idea of being gathered to your ancestors meant your bones were tossed on the heap of the bones of your ancestors, and you were no longer a discernible entity, a discernible individual. Your bones were just scattered among the bones of your ancestors. But yeah, the idea was not that we're going to put the body in this tomb and then we're going to open up the tomb and take the body and take it somewhere else. It would have been intended to be permanently placed there. Trevor, thank you so much for the question. Did Jesus intentionally set off the Romans to be crucified, maybe to usher in the apocalypse, or was he surprised? Did he think he was the Messiah? I think the historical Jesus probably thought he was the Messiah. There is an argument to make that Mark represents Judas as trying to set up the showdown between Jesus and the Romans, and that turned out to not work according to Judas's plans. And then in the later Gospels then turned Judas into the Satan-inspired villain. I don't think that there's an argument to make that the historical Jesus was going to provoke the Romans because he thought he was, I'd have to consider that. I think there's a thin line to draw between what I'm thinking of. But I think Jesus probably was, yes, provoking the Romans, probably not to cause a showdown with him, but probably in the hopes that that would usher in, that would catalyze God's intervention or something like that. I think I've heard you recommend Anderson's Jacob and the Divine Trickster before, but anyway, I read it. What do you think of Anderson's attempt to sort of force the text to have a coherent theology? I found the Trickster stuff interesting, but the theological angle a bit, unsatisfactory. Yeah, overall, I think he's talking mainly about the Jacob cycle. And so I think there is going to be more coherence within the Jacob cycle than across the whole book of Genesis or across the whole Pentateuch. So the degree that he argues for a consistent approach that way, yeah, that's problematic. But in terms of within the Jacob cycle, I think the idea that God is represented as being willing to use deception to advance their interests and to ensure that the promise to Abraham is fulfilled, I think that's something that could reach across authorial seams and certainly be shared by different authors. But in terms of like a single coherent theology, yeah, I'm not as convinced that reaches across all those boundaries. Not a question. With regards to the earliest deity, the wiki article is a decent entry point for the Proto-Indo-European people and our best attempts to reconstruct the theoretical religion / myth that they may have shared. That's a great point. You can that would be a great place to start, but make sure that you verify, look up sources when they make claims. Question: I've heard claims of the 7-day week originating with the Mesopotamians, and that the idea of a festival / rest day on the 7th day also originated with them, and then it was likely adopted during the exile. Could you shed some light on that? The idea of the Sabbath pre-existed the exile, but it was probably not a regular something that occurred at regular intervals. The Sabbath was probably something that was declared by a ruler or something that occurred with specific festivals. It was probably with the Mesopotamians that it became a regimented every 7 days thing on the first day of the week. And scholars suggest that because it's in Mesopotamia that we see 7-day cycles. Excuse me. That's where we see cycles of 7 and things like that bubbling to the surface first. And so likely they took the earlier, hey, every now and then we have a Sabbath, and said, now we're going to do it every 7 days. That's probably where the Sabbath originates. And I think it's not irrelevant that that's also where we get the priestly creation account, which talks about the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. That's probably the institution of this idea. And there's an argument to make at the intersection of time and space. If we no longer have the temple, sacred space where we worship God, the next best thing might be to carve out some sacred time where we worship God. So the Sabbath as a weekly event might be an attempt to kind of replace the missing sacred space with carving out space within sacred time. But that's just a theory. Addendum: are there any books or papers you suggest on the development on the Sabbath and its relation to Mesopotamia? Excuse me. Hang on just a second. These two papers come to mind. I don't know how detailed they're going to be, but the first is Oded Tammuz, the Sabbath as the seventh day of the week and a day of rest. Since when? And then what do we... and the finding here seems to be, if this is correct, the origin of the Sabbath is earlier than the Persian period. And then we also have Sabbath and sanctuary cult in the holiness legislation, a reassessment, where they find H's distinctive concept of the Sabbath may rather reflect a Persian period context when collective obligations to the cult were renegotiated to ensure the success of the Second Temple. I'd have to look into monographs on this. Surely they're out there. I'm not aware of them off the top of my head, however. Jesse Koenig, thank you so much for the question. Have you heard of Alex O'Connor? And if you have you thought about having him on Data Over Dogma, maybe related to the rise in cultural Christianity? Yes, I have heard of Alex O'Connor. I'm aware of his work. We've got lots of other guests that we're working on getting on the Data Over Dogma podcast. Maybe at some point in the future, we'll think about having him on. But yeah, it would be an interesting discussion, but I don't know that he goes on other podcasts very frequently. But yeah, I'd have to figure out how to reach out to him. But yeah, I'm not opposed to that by any stretch of the imagination. Josiah, thank you so much for the question. I had learned that arsenokite was a hapax legomenon, and therefore its meaning was very uncertain. Where does the idea that it refers to an active male role in same-sex intercourse come from? This is a neologism that Paul came up with, and very clearly it's based on the Greek translations of Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20, where we have the man and the bed, arsen, and the word for bed. I'm forgetting what the singular in Greek is off the top of my head, but Paul is very clearly basing that on his reading of Leviticus 18 and 20, where it's talking about we have in the Hebrew mishkevei isha, which is the lyings down of a woman, and it says a man will not lie with a male will not lie with a man, the lying downs of a woman. The idea being you are not going to have sex with a man the way you would with a woman, and so that means taking the active role. And I think Saul Oleon's 1996 article on this is the best discussion of what's going on in the Hebrew. I would recommend Loader on the New Testament on sexuality for a discussion, what I think is probably the best discussion of what's going on with arsenokite. Yeah, that's what I would say about that. There is some uncertainty, but not enough, I don't think, to make a plausible case that it's referring to something other than kind of a general condemnation of male same-sex intercourse, which Paul would have seen as the result of the agency of the insertive partner, because the receptive partner's agency would have been irrelevant because they were being emasculated, they were being feminized, they were being put in the submissive subservient role. And Paul probably could not have conceived of a reason why a man would want to seek out that role. Certainly they had no concept of a versatile role. So yeah, I don't think there are good arguments to make for other readings. That does not mean there are no arguments for other readings. I don't think there are any that are convincing, though. Sketchy, thank you so much for the question. CSR question, what makes the one true religion a good selling tool? I get wanting to be right, but if multiple religions use it, it kind of makes you want to pause. Hope this question makes sense. I think it has to do with competition between groups. When you're just one city trying to defend yourself against other cities, you have it is fine to just think, well, our deities are in competition. But since the rise of philosophical monotheism and the notions that there can only be one superlative entity out there, orchestrating all of this. I think that makes the most philosophical sense from the point of view of theism, then having one true religion also makes most sense. And I think I would check out, well, I'm not going to talk much about monotheism. I don't know that CSR has done a ton of work directly related to monotheism. Like Aranor and Sion and others have done a lot of work on pro-social deities within large civilizations and big gods, as Nor and Sion's book on that. But I don't think it talks about the monotheistic ideal. But yeah, I think that's at the root of that idea. Peachcraft, I think I saw you at FanX this year. I was there all 3 days. Thank you for the content that pushes back on individuals using the Bible to target vulnerable groups or push certain policy. Keep it up. Well, thank you so much for the kind words. I appreciate it. And next time you see me, don't be afraid to come up and say hi. JP Etcheber. And I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. I apologize. In your view, what's the most interesting development in biblical scholarship to come about this year, 2024? That's a difficult question. It's not been the most groundbreaking year in biblical scholarship, but certainly there have been interesting things. We've potentially there's something that was actually a discovery made back in 2004 that was published about in 2010 and then again in 2021 and now again in 2024 with a scholar from Johns Hopkins named Glenn Schwartz, who claims to have found some little clay cylinders with some kind of writing inscribed in them, and he argues that these are the earliest alphabetic writings. And the problem is that most scholars would say alphabetic writing developed in Egypt/Sinai around 1900 BCE, and these cylinders come from Syria from 2400 BCE. So they're 500 years earlier than the earliest known alphabetic script from a different part of ancient West Asia. So it would seriously throw off our understanding of the development of an alphabetic script. And I'm going to be making a video on this later this week, but that's probably the most interesting claim that I've seen made recently in biblical scholarship. But people whose opinions I respect have raised concerns with the evidence for this. So it's going to be something that's going to continue to be debated. Yeah, I think that's the most interesting thing I have seen recently, but certainly there will be more coming out in the future. Oh, hi, Brandon. Didn't realize you were in the chat. Welcome. And I rarely have time to come over and visit the the chat, which is unfortunate, but hope everybody's playing nice. What about the Leviathan seal as a runner for most interesting development? I think that's definitely a very cool development. Most interesting, I don't think it is as interesting as perhaps rewriting our understanding of the development of the alphabetic script. But yeah, that's certainly an interesting. And who was that? Was that Keel or was that Uhlinger who published that? And if you don't know what that is about, there was a paper published this year in Near Eastern Archaeology, Mastering the Seven-Headed Serpent. A stamp seal from Hatzor provides a missing link between cuneiform and biblical mythology. And here on the right side, you can see you have a figure, probably to be identified with a storm deity, who is about to plunge a spear into this seven-headed serpent creature, who is probably to be identified with Leviathan. So that was a fascinating discovery. Surely the Mount Ebal curse tablet is interesting enough to count for several years over. It's as old as the book of Job, at least. The book of Job is not that old, but yeah, that's I think been the most outrageous claim that's been made, but not one that many folks are taking seriously. And I saw Brendan recommended William Loder's book, Sex Then and Now, Sexualities in the Bible. I was not aware of this book. That it looks like it came out 2022, a Whipfenstock book, which means it's it's short and it's cheap. I'll have to check that one out. Thank you for the recommendation. Would you recommend the Oxford Annotated Book of Mormon? That would be this one right here. And yes, if you're interested in the Book of Mormon, I would definitely recommend this. Grant Hardy was the editor. Grant Hardy's been doing a lot of great work on this. And this is kind of in the same style as the Oxford Annotated Bible and stuff like that. The thing that I don't like about it is that the names that are where there are more than one person who has the same name, like Nephi and Alma and things like that, Hardy puts a little subscript 1, 2, 3 next to the name to indicate who it is, and I've found that kind of distracting. I'm not a huge fan of that. But certainly a great publication. Is there a book that contains non-canonical texts, including Gnostic scriptures, apocrypha, and pseudepigrapha? You've got James Charlesworth's 2 volumes. Old Testament pseudepigrapha and Old Testament apocrypha. Let me pull those up for you real quick. Or actually, it's just called Old Testament pseudepigrapha, and there are 2 volumes. And this is a big file, so it's being kind of a jerk. But that's volume 2, expansions of the Old Testament and legends, wisdom and philosophical literature, prayers, psalms, and odes, fragments of lost Judeo-Hellenistic works. And then volume 1 is apocalyptic literature and testaments. So in terms of Hebrew Bible, apocrypha, and pseudepigrapha, that's the go-to at the moment. Certainly there are newer ones being produced. These are a little bit old. When it comes to Gospels and Gnostic stuff, Bart Ehrman and a colleague published a book called The Other Gospels, accounts of Jesus from outside the New Testament. And so you've got a bunch of these: infancy gospels, ministry gospels, sayings gospels, and agrapha, passion, resurrection, and post-resurrection gospels. And these are introductions and translations of all these different gospels, some of them being Gnostic. So that's a good place to go for that. And then the Nag Hammadi library is mostly Gnostic stuff. So you can go there for a bunch of other Gnostic stuff. The definitive translation of the Gnostic scriptures, complete in 1 volume, by Robinson. So that will give you more than enough reading for the next little while. We should translate the Book of Mormon into Old Testament Hebrew. I don't know why, but we should. I don't know how well you can see it. Yeah, you probably can't see it at all. There's a white. This white volume right here is a Hebrew translation of the Book of Mormon, the 1981 version. It's not a great translation. It's just the selections from the Book of Mormon, and yeah, there's not really a good reason to translate it into ancient Hebrew. If there was only one excavation site you could dig at, what would it be? I would love to be at Tel Motsah, the temple that was discovered there. I don't know where they are right now in the excavations, but I would love to get an update on what they have been working on there. For that question about the Gnostic and other Gospels, as well as those volumes in the collected Nag Hammadi, if you want the kind of taster, there's a volume called The Other Bible. It's got a bunch of extracts and abridgments, not entirely scholarly, but it's a very wide-ranging volume. The Other Bible. I'm trying to think if I don't know if I have seen that. The Other Bible, first time in one volume, ancient scripture, Gnostic Gospels, Dead Sea Scroll, Visionary Wisdom, Text, Christian Apocrypha, Jewish Pseudepigrapha, Kabbalah. All of that? Harper, San Francisco. So it's a trade book. Oh yeah, that's just brief intros and a few snippets from each text. That's not, yeah, that would be a phenomenally long book to have all of those things in there. Happy Sky says, is he just going to ignore my question just so I know? I answered at least 2 questions from you in the super chat. I don't know which one you're talking about that I haven't answered. Is there an audiobook version of the Bible that you would recommend? I would recommend the NRSV UE. I don't know that there is an audiobook. But let me check and see. Yes, there is. Narrated by Michael Beck. The Holy Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition with the Apocrypha. That is on Audible. Oh, and in case anybody was wondering, I don't know if anybody was, but my publisher reached out to me today and said Audible is running a site-wide discount for their premium subscribers or something or other. And my book is part of it. And so it's a 56% discount if you pay for it directly. So it's not one of your credits that you use. You just pay for it directly. And it's like $9.91 or something like that. So if anybody was waiting to pre-order the audiobook of The Bible Says So, you can do it at a pretty steep discount right now through Audible. Hi, Dan from Bellingham, Washington. Hi, KJ. I'm going to be back up there Friday briefly. I'm taking my daughter to see Taylor Swift in Vancouver. And she was born in Bellingham, so we're going to stop by there on the way. What's your view on the documentary hypothesis of the Torah? I think that I am not in favor of the documentary hypothesis or the neo-documentary hypothesis, but certainly D and P and non-P are 3 broad divisions of the sources. So I think there is a lot of value in the source critical foundation that the documentary hypothesis has laid, but I don't think the full theory itself makes a ton of sense. Are you planning on making an episode on the Holy Ghost / Spirit and its identity in the OT and NT? We do have a Data Over Dogma episode on the Spirit. And well, we talk about the Holy Ghost and we also talk about the soul. So episode 65 is called I Got Soul and I'm Super Bad, and that's where we talk about the development of the concept of the soul. And then episode 53 is called Holy Ghost and Bears, where we talk about what the Holy Spirit is. So that would be the easiest place to find stuff. Ola, was Constantine a Trinitarian or an Arian? Constantine seemed to go back and forth, but seemed pretty sympathetic toward the Arian cause. But, you know, because the majority of the bishops that he invited to Nicaea to arrive at a consensus, arrived at the Trinitarian consensus, he wasn't about to reject that. I need to know, beard or no beard, which brings you closer to God? It depends on what I'm doing. But generally, I am pro-beard. Thanks, Dan. Just pre-ordered on Audible. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. You will make my publishers very happy. And the happier my publisher is, the happier I am likely going to be. And the quicker I will earn out and actually be able to make some money over and above my advance on this book, which would be quite the treat. What are your views on eating shrimp? That you should devein them first, and definitely don't eat the tails. But I can't eat shrimp anymore. I developed some adverse reactions to shellfish when I was an elder teen, and so I've stayed away ever since then. But I used to live in Gaithersburg / North Potomac in Maryland, and we would go to the Chesapeake every now and then and go crabbing and eat. We would have lobster, we would have crab, we would have shrimp, and I thought those were pretty tasty. And now I haven't eaten any of them in 30 years almost. I have a question. Gematria seems to be present in Book of Revelation 666. So why Christians never adopted Gematria and oral Torah? That's an interesting question. Yeah, they because I think the authorship of the New Testament represents a period prior to the divergence of Judaism and Christianity, and I think because some of the more mystical streams of Jewish tradition leaned into Gematria and things like that in oral Torah, I think Christians, in order to maintain their distinction, probably leaned away from those things. What's the fit for this video? The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, obviously. Hi, Dan. Any book recommendations for Revelation? Yes. The first thing I would recommend is the Anchor Yale Bible commentary on Revelation by Craig Kester. And that looks like this. This is going to be your best reference work on Revelation that's available now, but I understand that the Hermeneia series is coming out with a new Revelation volume at some point, so I usually prefer Hermeneia by a hair over Anchor. So when that comes out, I may give preference to that, but that's a good place. Timothy Beale has a biography of Revelation that is good. Yeah, they're oh shoot, what is the, and I don't know why I always forget her name. Elaine Pagels. Yeah, in 2012 she published a book called Revelations. That's not the name of the book of Revelation, but she titled her book Revelations. The subtitle is Visions, Prophecy, and Politics in the Book of Revelation. That's also a wonderful book. I would highly recommend. Happy Sky asks, do you believe in demonic possession? That's another theological question. I don't do theology, but I would point out there are certainly no data that point in the direction of that being something that's real. I'm really looking forward to his book. I can't believe he's making us wait until next year. Well, this is a specific version of my book called the Advanced Reader's Edition, or copy. ARC is how in the industry evidently they refer to these things. But so this is the uncorrected proof in a paperback version that does not have, like, the index pages are all blank. On Goodreads, the publisher is doing a giveaway of 50 of these copies right now. If you go to the books page on Goodreads, you can enter, I think it's going until December 11th, you can enter to win one of 50 of these ARCs. So you can get those well before the book itself is actually released on the 29th. Does your book talk about abortion? It does. Chapter 7. The Bible says abortion is murder. And so I then go into detail on what the data actually say about what the Bible says about abortion. What's for dinner? I believe we are making a roast tonight. About once a month, I generally make dinner, but about once a month, my wife will say, "Hey, I want to make a roast." So she's going to make that. We use pepperoncinis and carrots and mashed potatoes. It's really good. Do animals have souls? That's another theological question that is outside the boundaries of my channel, but I would point out that there are certainly no data that can be pointed to demonstrate the existence of what we understand to be a soul, either for humans or for animals. Is the Wisdom commentary series good? Yes. The Wisdom one is a queer feminist commentary series that, yes, is very good. I met the authors who wrote on Revelation at the annual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature, and I have her card right here, and I need to get in touch with her about coming on the podcast to talk about that. Were chapters of Daniel translated into Hebrew from Aramaic to give them greater validity? As I understand it, Greek transliteration of several proper nouns corresponds to Aramaic, where Hebrew is now. That's an interesting theory for why there are some Hebrew and some Aramaic portions of Daniel, but I don't think that's widely accepted by scholars, and I don't think the argument is particularly compelling for that. Do you watch Dragon Ball? I do not. Dan, it's Cyber Monday. Stock up on your stuff. Rabbi Tobias Singer's Let's Get Biblical. Any reviews from you? I don't know that I've seen many segments from that. I have heard Rabbi Singer say some things I agree with. I've heard him say some things I disagree with. What do you think about God, a biography by Jack Miles? I think I saw that when I was considering writing a story about how the God of the Bible changes from beginning to end. I might even have a copy somewhere, but I don't think I read much of it. But it looks like it might be doing something similar to what I want to do potentially in my next book. I'm weighing a few different options for the next trade book that I'm going to write, and two that I'm considering right now. One would be a book on how the God of the Bible changes from beginning to end, where I talk a little bit about reconstructing the God of Israel prior to the biblical text, and then I'd go down to the Council of Nicaea and the development of the Trinity. The other possibility would be a book discussing what is and is not historical in the Bible. So just go through the main characters and events and narratives and review what the data has to say about what's historical and what's not. So looking at the table of contents of Miles's book, God, a Biography, it looks like they're trying to paint a kind of broad macro narrative about God's relationship to their people with the different books of the Bible. So mine would be quite different from that, but it looks like it could have some valuable things to say. But if I read, I don't recall how much of it I read, and I don't remember what of it I happen to have read. Hi, Dan. Love your content. In my native language, there were 2 full Book of Mormon translations, but I know there were older ones the LDS Church has. Is there a way for regular folks like me to see those? Isfan, I don't know what your native language is, but they have digitized most of the translations that are in existence, whether they are in print or not. So there should be a way to find some of the older translations, but I would need to know what language it is you're talking about. Spencer Dahl, what size t-shirt do you wear? I generally wear a large, but yeah, the different manufacturers, a large is a different size for the different manufacturers. Have you been to other countries? I've been to dozens of other countries. When I worked for worked as a scripture translation supervisor for the LDS Church for just over a decade, I traveled internationally multiple times every year, so got to visit a lot of fascinating places, places I never even knew existed. Before somebody said, "This is you're being assigned this language. You need to book a trip to Kiribati or Pohnpei or something like that." I had no idea where those places were. And yeah, I met some of the coolest people in the world. Doc, from the historic accounts and biblical references, were the apostles Trinitarians? No. The Trinity developed between the middle of the second century CE down to the 5th century CE. But yeah, they didn't understand Jesus's relationship to God in a Trinitarian sense. Hi, Dan. Pine Creek has recently made a few videos critical of some of your content. Any plans to respond? No. They're welcome to be critical of my content if they like. What is your opinion on Gary Habermas's argument? I assume you mean the minimal facts argument. And even if one accepts all of those minimal facts, there are far better explanations for them than that a dude came back from the dead. So I think people would do well to get better educated about the psychology of religion, the cognitive science of religion, how identity politics work, why people do the things that they do for the sake of belonging, for the sake of clout, for the sake of attention, for the sake of their families and things like that. The notion that people wouldn't go to their deaths for the sake of something that they did not know for a fact to be true is ridiculous. People do that every single day around the world. Oh, this is Kaysen, by the way, the guy in Disneyland. Hi, Kaysen. And if I recall, your wife's name was Erica, correct? Thank you for saying hi. And if I look kind of distracted, it was the end of a long day, and we just had a rough 40-minute wait in what was supposed to be a 5-minute line. So apologize if I was a little spacey. Apologies if you have already, but can you please make critical responses to Jordan Peterson's videos on the Bible and Christianity? I've made a handful of them, but I'm going to check out the new stuff that he's working on. I might have to break down and get a copy of his book too. Blessing Jacob Sunil, thank you so much for the comment. Did Jesus rose from the dead? Any word on resurrection? I don't think the data support the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. I think the data far more squarely fall on the side of that being a tradition that arose among the early followers of Jesus. Were early Christians considering themselves divine just like Jesus was divine? I mean, the Gospel of John kind of makes the case that salvation is about becoming one with Jesus the same way that Jesus is one with God. So, theosis, apotheosis, divinization, those were all features of early Christian soteriology and are still found within some of the Eastern Christian traditions. So, surely there were some who thought that. Colin Flannery asks, given the difficulty of writing on papyrus in real time, how is it possible for Jesus's longer speeches and discussions supposedly recorded? It's implausible. The Jesus's sermons were 100% later literary creations. They might be cobbling together small sayings that may have been in circulation from the time of Jesus's life, but the sermons as we find them now are all literary creations. Hey, Dan, what initially sparked your interest in applying a cognitive framework to your academic studies? When I went to my second master's degree at Trinity Western University, I wanted to write my thesis on the development of monotheism, but I couldn't find a satisfactory answer to the question of what a God was. And so I decided to write my thesis instead on what a deity was. And the only approach that I found that I felt actually provided adequate answers was cognitive linguistics. And in the process of writing that thesis, I also came across the cognitive science of religion. And for my doctoral dissertation, I wanted to further explore how the authors of the Bible understood the concepts of deity and the concepts related to deity. And so I incorporated cognitive linguistics and the cognitive science of religion into my doctoral dissertation on that. Wait, what's the difference between theosis and apotheosis? So etymologically, they should be complete opposites, and they both mean exactly the same thing, which is divinization. What do you have to say about arguments for the existence of God? You surely also know philosophy. I don't find them particularly convincing. I think there are better explanations. Does the Book of Enoch showcase that there was a belief in hell in Second Temple Judaism, but that it was only for wicked angels, not men? You do see a concept of post-mortem divine punishment for humans as well as angels in the Enochic literature. I think the punishment of angels later gets democratized and becomes for all wicked people. So I don't think post-mortem divine punishment is limited only to angels in the Book of Enoch, but that's certainly the inspiration for the later idea of eternal conscious torment as the main post-mortem divine punishment for people. What do you think of the Chosen series? I have actually not watched the Chosen series. I don't have a ton of time for watching TV, but I have become good friends with one of the actors from the series who appreciates my content quite a lot. And I was able to run into him at a recent Comic-Con and chat with him for a bit. So I probably owe him a watching of the series, but to this point, I haven't had the opportunity. Dan, the Hungarian Book of Mormon translation manuscript I meant is the Adis von Haragos translation from 1932. The LDS catalog says it's closed to research. Is that only open for certain people? If this is a manuscript that was never published and the Church History Library doesn't have it open for research, then yeah, it would only be available for certain people. And unfortunately, it would need to be pretty high-ranking people. But give me just 1 second. Yeah, it looks like the draft was never published. So yeah, that would be a draft manuscript. So that is not going to be open to the public if the Church History Library says closed to research. And that really annoyed me when it said things like that, particularly when I was working as a scripture translation supervisor. I needed access to that kind of stuff, and they always gave me a hard time about it. What good books for biblical background for a newbie? No, my wife is home, so it sounds like I'm going to have to go here in a second. A History of the Bible by John Barton, The Book and Its Faiths, is the best introduction to the Bible and its background from a scholarly perspective that's available right now. Well, Colin Flannery, thank you so much for a very generous super sticker. I appreciate it. What chair do you use? Looks comfy. Sit Mod, I think it's called. It is pretty comfy. It even has a footrest that slides out from the bottom. And it also has a movable lumbar support. Yeah, I like it. Hi, Dan. What Greek philosophers would you say were most influential to Paul's concept of God? I think Plato is obviously very influential. Pythagoreanism as it existed in the first century, Stoicism as it existed in the first century were also influential, but it wasn't like you were for one team and not for any other teams. It was more of a take from here and from here and from here and mash together and get your own ideas kind of situation, in my opinion. All right, my wife has come in the door, so I'm going to have to go, everybody. Thank you so much for your time and for your attention, for some wonderful questions. I appreciate it very much. Wouldn't be able to do what I am able to do for a living without y'all, and that means the world to me. So thank you so much. Hope you all have a wonderful week. Hope you have people around you who love you very much. Hope you have a warm, safe place to spend the night. Hope you have adequate food on the table, and I will see you all around. Bye, everybody.